Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Leadership. Thank you for joining me on what is a very new series under the Talking Leadership banner. Over the next weeks and months, I'll be looking at a couple of different industry sectors, and I thought I would start with the Australian military perspective, and it is an interesting world to talk about. And so based on that, I've reached out to a previous podcast guest in Mr. Ben Deverson. How are you, Ben?
I am very good. Thanks, Eric.
Mate, thanks for joining me. Ben is going to co-host this series with me, our inaugural guest for this series of podcasts, and I'm glad to be able to take some time out. I know things are busy for those of you in the consulting space. So he is the director at the 8th Mile Consulting. I'd like to welcome David Neal. How are you, David?
It's great to meet you guys face to face, and I love some of the work you've been doing up until now. So.
Thanks, mate. There's a good bit of feedback. Sometimes when you put these things out, you don't get a lot of feedback, so I do appreciate that. Mate, before we kick off, I'd like to ask you, David, initially to give the listeners a bit of your background, if you could, please.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Australian, Canberra, born and raised, for better or for worse. I went to an all-guys school in Canberra. I did a whole bunch of sports in my younger years, a whole suite of different things, everything from karate all the way through to volleyball, and everything in between. I then joined the military when I was 18. I went through the officer stream, so I went through ADFA, RMC, that general bag, and then I did a 13.5-year career there. And during that time, I also became a father, and I had 2 kids whilst I was in the military and one when I was out. When I left the military, I went into project management, rolling out some very, very large scale IT projects. And then I went into the creation of the 8th Mile Consulting with my business partner and friend, who's been there for a very large portion of that journey that I mentioned. And the rest is kind of history. We've been rummaging around the consulting world in our own kind of style for the last nearly 2 years now.
Thank you, David. Over to my co-host, Ben. Ben, could you give the listeners a bit of your background, please?
Oh, look, a little bit like David, I joined the military at 18 myself, although I went straight into the Royal Military College. I missed out on actually getting into ADFA, but so did my time at Duntroon, got out of Duntroon as a 19-year-old, so fairly green, did my degree later, and a little bit, again, like David, I spent about 8 to 9 years serving, and I then got out into the civilian world and did utilise my business degree in human resources and started working as an HR manager. And after a while, working in professional services in particular, spent about, probably 10 years working in professional services in 2 large accounting firms, went into some commercial roles and ended up back in the professional services space about 6 years ago as the chief executive officer of a law firm. And after 5 years working there, I thought, I might take those skills and start my own consulting gig, servicing or exclusively servicing the legal profession. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm the founder and director of a business called Lawganised, and I look after small to medium law firms in terms of their practice management and operational aspects of their business. So I let the lawyers practice law and I do all the rest. So that's me in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. That sets a bit of a context for the conversations that we're going to have now. So, David, over to you, mate. I'd like to put question 1 to you if I could. What was the beginning of your leadership pathway, mate? If you can draw your mind back to the olden days, maybe you don't look too old, but back when you started out, what kicked off an interest in leadership, or at least your pathway into leadership?
Yeah, sure. So I had an interest in leadership from a very young age. I was very fortunate to be surrounded by incredible mentors. My dad was very high up in leadership in the Australian Public Service, and I guess many people have a story where they kind of learnt what not to do from the beginning. I think I was kind of blessed to have the other end of the stick, and I was surrounded by some really positive people that I guess they approached it from teaching me how to think, not what to think, and also I guess approaching it from an angle of influence. How do you get from A to B in life without having to leverage on all the systems, but instead leveraging on your influence and your reputation? And I think that flowed out in my younger years. I was in the Australian team for the karate. And I had some leadership roles in that. I went to the World Championships at a young age for that. And then I was in team events and kind of the captain for those teams and those sorts of things. And I learned very, very quickly that kind of whinging about leadership doesn't change your influence. If anything, it just degrades it. So you actually have to have influence in order to get things done. And so the next questions from that were always like, well, how do you do that? How do you get better at it? You know, who do you lean on? Who do you not lean on? Those sorts of things. And they were early questions that my dad was posing and many other good mentors at the same time.
Thank you for that. Just as a quick follow-up, in the other podcasts that I've done, to a T of the background in sports has come up quite a lot. And although it's not the focus of the podcast, I'm just interested and like to get your perspective on this. Did sports have that igniting thing for you, the light bulb moment, maybe when you're younger, that leadership is something you wanted to pursue? Is that not something you thought about, or did you naturally get into leadership roles whilst playing sport? Because I from what I've seen in my travels, and I've never participated in a sport at the level that you're talking about, representing my country, but I've seen it in sports like futsal, and I coach at the school level, or an assistant coach at a school level, and you see the competitive nature in some kids, and they tend to gravitate to certain kids because of the way that they organise themselves. Did you have a sense of that as you were coming up in your sport?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I think if I could be brutally honest, and it might go against the status quo a little bit here, I have a lot of love for competitive sports, and I like the fact that I've been taught how to lose, and I've lost so many things, so many times. And then when I went into karate, I got my ass kicked so many times that you learn a new, I guess, perspective on if you want to achieve things in life, it's going to be hard. And by acknowledging an expectation, managing that early, you can be in the right frame of mind and pull people along behind you who can draw some of that energy from you and then later on give it back to you. And so sports was the first conduit for me to do that. It allowed me to get my ass kicked and realize that the world isn't about me. And I guess that's the first time I learned that leadership is not about you. Leadership is about the team. And the moment your ego or your pride got in the way was the moment you got your ass kicked every single time. And that was across every sport that I was playing. And the patterns started to emerge over and over and over again that, you know, the moment you were like, yeah, this is about me and this is about me winning, it's the moment you lost. And then you had to go back to the start line and go, what went wrong there? And enough iterations of getting it wrong, you'll eventually start figuring out what goes right.
Ben, over to you, mate.
Yeah, no, there's some great perspectives, David. I really appreciate those contexts with the context with sport. But just want to draw now to your military experience and then moving into the civilian experience. So what are your views on leadership in the military setting versus the civilian setting?
This is a good one. I think they're fundamentally different environments, but the general rules of leadership remain extant is probably my answer to that. And I'll explain a little bit of the context. So, you know, in the military, the environment is surrounded by leaders. You have a culture of mentoring, and you always, at any point in time, have a level of competition that keeps people super focused about, you know, get higher performance, you know, better effectiveness, more efficiencies, all those sorts of things. New technologies change, like it's constantly changing because you're growing, you're in a global strategic changing environment. You can't stop. No one else is stopping, you can't stop. And so I think that is, from that perspective, you know, is a really fundamental difference to what I've experienced in the corporate world, where it is always changing, the technology is always changing as well, but the people in each of these organizations and teams aren't necessarily surrounded by what good looks like. And so the emergence of good, what I would call excellent leaders, is rarer because they've had to kind of bounce around a myriad of different experiences to get to the point that you could say they're an excellent leader. And so therefore there are less of them. Whereas in the military, they've got a structure that grooms them from end to end. There's a culture of professional development. My take on this is probably goes against, again, the status quo a little bit. I actually think it's harder to lead in the corporate and commercial world. I think it's more difficult because you're not necessarily supported by the frameworks and the mindset of everyone running in the same direction, and that I guess that early creation of a selfless, self-aware individual within a team, and everyone's kind of are inspired and influenced by different things, and that makes it a lot more complex. So I actually have a lot of respect for those leaders that have developed their leadership skills to what I would call an excellent standard in the commercial and corporate context, because they've done it against all odds. They weren't necessarily supported by the same frameworks. That's what I reckon.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And I think when you look at those locations and let's call them management schools that we went to, and that are effectively designed to produce leaders, that's one thing I've found in the civilian context is there isn't actually a leadership framework that people, as they develop in their career, actually follow. So that the people you come across in the commercial world that are actually exceptional leaders have essentially done it in their own steam.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it's been done by trial and error. And I would also say it comes through a culture of understanding risk and opportunity. People who have not had a lot of exposure to people in the military, like I was infantry corps, so I did, combat tours and all that sort of stuff. My understanding of risk is a skewed version of the understanding of risk and opportunity in a commercial and corporate context, but it's still the same fundamental, give and take relationship. So the people would look at people in the military and say, geez, they have a risky job. But at the same time, medical is paid for, housing is paid for. They have well-defined professional development processes that get them from end to end. There is career development. Everything is structured for them. That element of risk is gone. Whereas in the commercial and the corporate and civilian context, people are just doing it by themselves. It is infinitely harder, in my opinion, to be doing that. I have so much more respect for people like farmers and people who are like relying on the weather to get their income for the year. I mean, that level of risk for me absolutely blows my mind. I would happily run around, again, getting shot at and shooting people any day of the week than risking the livelihood of my family on things that were outside my environmental control. That for me is a whole new level of leadership and risk and opportunity understanding that it makes my gut churn. But, it's all, the grass is kind of greener or at least different on the other side.
Yeah, that's a great point, the farmer point. I couldn't agree with you more.
From what you said, trying to paraphrase quickly here, is that everyone in the military context has to deal with change on a regular basis. It has to aim for excellence because of the nature of what you do. And I guess that changes in intensity, whether you're in a forward position or you're out, like you said, dodging bullets versus maybe not in that position, but supporting those that are. What do you believe is maybe one leadership skill that you've adapted from the military context that you've brought into the civilian world?
Yeah, okay. So there's a whole bunch of, I reckon, leadership traits that we could discuss, but I think there's this linkage between self-awareness and selflessness. You'll see behind me, you can see it, but in the audio bit, they won't be able to see it. But one of the values of my organization is service. There's no surprises there, and we can all figure out the lineage of why. But one of the things I'll tell you about is when I first, joined LinkedIn, someone was like, you got to go have a look at this platform, right? I went in and I wrote a message and it said, leadership is not about you. And then I wrote 3 things that it was and 3 things that it wasn't. And that went to 7,500 reshares in under a month. And I'll be honest, it really frustrated me. It got under my skin because it shouldn't have been a message that should have been surprising in any way. That, in my opinion, should have been a run-of-the-mill comment that just is intertwined in everyone's culture. But for some reason, it resonated with people. I got thousands of messages from this off-the-cuff thing that I just wrote on this, on a train sort of thing. And it resonated with people so deeply. And then it dawned on me that that this is probably one of the most significant things missing from the civilian context. People talk a really big game about selflessness and accountability, but when it comes to the crunch, it comes to the moment to say, I royally stuffed this and I need help. or I've stuffed this and we're going to need a rally to fix my problem, but it's a team effort, and just level this culture of accountability about getting the job done, but leaving your pride and ego at the door has been one of the cornerstones for my brand and the growth of my brand, because we've come out of the gates and said, of course, leadership's about that. And everywhere we've done it in the civilian world, we come out and we tell a story about how we stuff something. And they look at you like, how could you do this? You're ruining your brand. But it actually is quite the opposite every time. And it links to integrity and it also links to gaining the initiative and all these sorts of things. And they all intertwine. But it seems to be that kind of X factor that a lot of people have not seen what good looks like. And I think that is probably one of the biggest areas for opportunity for many people in the leadership space in the civilian world.
Defining what effective or what good looks like is always the trick, and that's going to vary industry to industry. But yeah, totally understand where you're coming from, mate.
I apologise now. I think I was one of the 7,500 shares.
Awesome.
So I say that because you and I share a very, very similar viewpoint there, that leadership is a service. And that's probably something I've found in my career, particularly in the commercial world, is that there can be a sense of entitlement to leaders where they are to be served, and that they are above those that they are above the people that work for them. So I do find that quite a challenge sometimes, particularly with that lack of leadership awareness and self-awareness. But the key point I think you made there was the ability to be vulnerable and to say, I have stuffed this up and I need the help of my people to fix this. And a leader that can do that, in my view, has a big tick in the box in terms of being self-aware, being vulnerable, and showing that vulnerability in the sense that they actually can make mistakes and it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. In a military planning and operational context, you are defined boundaries. So it's no surprises when I heard that. That's part of the fundamental approach to strategizing and planning in the military. And it's counterintuitive in its nature, insofar that the more boundaries you give someone, and then followed by a clear understanding of what the expectations are on the back end of that. And that was normally defined as what was called the commander's intent: purpose, method, end state. Purpose was why, method was how, end state was the measure of success. How do we know we've achieved success when we got there?
I think it's in some ways about respecting professional courtesy. So if let's say I was working on for you and you tasked me to do something, if I get an inkling that you're at my age now, because I've had some experience in the world of work, much like you and Ben have, if you start to micromanage me, I'm going to look for ways to get out the door, because I can't operate like that. If I can't be trusted to do my job, then I'd rather do it for someone else or not get paid and do something different. It's my tolerance for being micromanaged is sort of gone out the door.
So, David, just moving on, trying to continue those comparisons between military and civilian life. So, in your experience, is leadership in military life qualitatively different than the civilian context?
I would say that the overall standard of leadership is higher in the military. But as I said before, I would say that the anomalies of excellent leaders in the civilian and commercial context are probably the best leaders I've ever met in the world, because they've done it against all odds in much more dynamic environment in the sense of framework, structure, and organization and hierarchies. They've actually done it via the truest form of leadership, which is influence. And I guess we'll go on to other questions about whether leaders are born and whether they're made or whatnot. But I think if you look at the best leaders in the commercial and corporate context, man, it blows my mind how they've gotten to that level of aptitude and utility in their leadership skills against, what were completely variables in the way that they were groomed and grown. Whereas in the military, you've got you've got a step A, B, C, D, E, and you grow a good leader. And sometimes there's some raw talent in that lets some people even separate further from the pack. So you'll have the best leaders of good leaders and all that sort of stuff. And it's not unusual to, as you know, Ben, to be critiqued against other leaders and go, well, you're lacking in these skills and this is a competitive position and therefore you've got to be better at this and this and this in order to get this team moving. But it's still pretty safe. Like, even if you don't get that gig, you're going to go into another leadership gig and, that sort of thing. And there was always the concept of the strategic corporal, and that leadership is everyone's responsibility in the military, regardless of your position. The idea of a strategic corporal was that if someone stuffed it, even at the private level, all the way through to the brigadier level, it didn't matter at the strategic level because the news would still make the same spin on the same story. So everyone was in a position of responsibility and leadership. And so even soldiers are like, yep, I'll lead this, I'll lead this, I'll lead this, I'll lead my team. I might not even have a position, but I'll lead it anyway. I'll volunteer for this. And there's that culture. But in the commercial and corporate context, as you said, Eric, people talk with their feet. If you piss them off, if you get it wrong, you don't, if their expectations are not met about your leadership style, they just go somewhere else. That doesn't happen in the military. They might go onesies and twosies, but there'll be someone who plugs the gap pretty quickly. That's a hard one to fill.
One thing that I can capture with that response, and it's very interesting that you said it, that in the military context, everyone needs to fill those positions and you get trained to have that mindset, where in the civilian world, it really isn't like that. When people take on jobs, you're not necessarily taking on a job to lead within an organization. Sure, you'll have some responsibilities, but they don't necessarily equate to that leadership function. Maybe a management function, and that if you're going to get more granular than that, then you've got leadership in the corporate world versus managerial responsibilities in the corporate world versus not being any of those positions in a corporate non-military context. So it does differ, and it makes for an interesting comparison. I'm blown away and interested that you said you think leadership is better in the military context, and I'm sure that's up for debate. Why I'm interested in that statement is I've been asking a question of people for a little while based on my studies, and I'm almost completed those. But if I asked a question of just some random person I met, or particularly my colleagues, do you believe we have fit for future leaders in industry X, Y, Z? The answer is not always a yes. And if you dig deep into why that is, a lot of the times is the culture that brings up leaders in certain industries is not as strong as it needs to be. And when you talk about those things that facilitate people becoming better leaders, that differs so much between industries, it's not funny. And you wouldn't have a world of consultancy trying to build leadership skill if that was already working properly in the corporate sector anyway.